Okay, so I'll just start again here. So one of the criticisms of dispensationalism from other Christians is that it is too focused on the distant future, meaning that a lot of Bible prophecy is going to be inapplicable to most of the people living during Bible times, and perhaps people living in between the Bible times. Because of the futuristic focus of uh, dispensationalism, such as looking forward to the fulfillment of prophecies concerning Israel, concerning the tribulation and the millennium, it disconnects biblical prophecy from the audience that Scripture talks about, like the Jews here. The Bible then becomes a kind of code book for end times enthusiasts, sidelining practical value for God's people across history. And in fact, I would say, yeah, sure, some dispensationalists do become too enthusiastic with their interpretations. But chapters like this, like Daniel chapter 8, push back on this. This is a text that sure shows a futuristic prophecy for the Jews that were living at that time. This would have been Daniel's time in the 6th century BC. But it has clear and verifiable fulfillment within the next 350 to 400 years. And so they got to see this fulfillment, and we can look back in history and see the fulfillment and see just how God intends for prophecy to be fulfilled. This prophecy answered their present condition, and it prepared them for future suffering that they would endure within a few generations. This wasn't some vague vision of something that would happen some 2,200 years later. This equipped God's covenant people for trials that they would actually face in the coming decades and centuries. Now, unlike the previous chapters, this is a unique chapter. At this point, Daniel begins, or I should say, resumes writing in Hebrew, the language of God's people. He is no longer writing in Aramaic. He wants God's people to know this. In fact, the rest of the book of Daniel is going to be in Hebrew, because this is preparing God's people. This is going to be getting toward the end of the Babylonian captivity, with the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire on the horizon. The Jewish people might have been worried about all this. They were wondering about their immediate future. They might wonder if they were going to survive the conquering of Babylon by the Persians in the subsequent years. They may have been worried if they would go back to their homeland like God promised. They may have worried whether they would be safe there. God gives them an overview of the next few hundred years so that they know exactly what to expect and exactly what will happen. And this is going to actually lead us into what is known as the intertestamental period, which is the period, you might say, that sounds like a really big word. It is a really big word. Hard to spell until you get until you break it down. It is literally between the testaments. And it is that time between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. And so we are going to be seeing that time frame highlighted by Daniel, not only here, but later on as well. And so this is a prophecy for God's people, for their near and coming future. But it also still gives us a picture of what is yet to come later on the world stage, those things that we are still waiting for. Because in this chapter, we are going to see descriptions of the Antichrist. We're going to see descriptions of an Antichrist that rose up one that was named Antiochus Epiphanes. But as we look at this historical preview, we are going to see the ultimate enemy of God's people, who will arise on the last days. As John says in 1 John 4:3, the spirit of the Antichrist is already in the world. And so we are going to be seeing this spirit as it rises, and there's going to be ebbs and flows to all of this. The spirit of Antichrist is already at work. What does that mean? Well, we're going to be seeing in Antiochus's ability to destroy and to deceive, we're going to see some historically tangible reflection of what the future Antichrist is going to be. And so there's a lot to look at here. There's a lot to take apart here. And that's one of the reasons I want to take a couple of weeks on this chapter instead of just doing it all in one sermon, as a lot of folks do. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with only doing it in one sermon. But we want to take our time to look at this. Plus, some of the history may not be familiar to you, so I don't want to just skim too quickly over that. We're going to be seeing this history as we spend the next couple of weeks here. And we're also going to see that God's people are going to receive comfort, as well as a warning of what is to come. We will also see a foreshadowing of the final Antichrist once again. And so today, we are going to see first that God's people need to know about the coming of Persia. They need to know about the coming of Persia. We're going to look at that in verses 1 through 4. Second, we're going to see that they need not worry about Persia. They don't need to worry about it. So I wanted to see, yes, this is practical. God's people needed to know about the coming of Persia, but they don't need to worry about the coming of Persia. We'll see that in verses 5 and 7. And that's going to be because of the rise of the Greek Empire, the rise of Alexander the Great. You might say, well, maybe they need to worry about Alec. Nope, we're going to see next in verse 8 that they don't need to worry about Alexander either. Alexander is not going to be that much of a concern to the Jewish people. We'll talk more about him in future studies in the book of Daniel. But there is one that they do need to know about, and that is going to be this guy, Antiochus. And if you've been hearing me say his name and you're wondering how it's spelled, there it is on the screen, Antiochus, Antiochus. And we're going to begin looking at him tonight. We'll dig more into him next week, Lord willing. But for now, let's begin looking at this astonishing prophecy and its past fulfillments. First, God's people need to know about the coming of Persia. Let's go ahead and reread those first 4 verses. In the year of the reign of Belshazzar, the king, a vision appeared to me, and that would be to Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam. And I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai Canal. Then I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram, which had 2 horns, was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power. But he did as he pleased and magnified himself. Right, so these opening verses place this vision around the year 551 to 550 BC. So this is right in the middle of the 6th century BC. This would only be 2 years after the vision of chapter 7. And so that's why Daniel says this is a vision that appeared to him subsequent to the one which appeared previously. And so this is right on the heels of the previous vision. Um, that means that Babylon is still going to be there for a few years. Babylon has not fallen, and it's not going to fall for a little while. It's This is before the events that we read about in chapter 5. At this point in history, Babylon is still strong, but its days are numbered. Why? Because Cyrus the Persian would have just conquered the Median Empire. And that's going to lead to the creation of the Medo-Persia Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, which will topple Babylon in 12 years. And so it's coming. This is coming. And that means that the Babylonian captivity, at least for this moment that Daniel is penning this in the middle of the 6th century, it is not quite over. It's not quite there. But the Lord still sends Daniel this vision. And Daniel knows, of course, that God's people need to know this vision. And so he writes this vision in Hebrew, and he will get it out to his people. And it may even be that Belshazzar found out about this vision. One commentary notes that he may have found out about this vision, and that might even be one of the reasons why he was blaspheming Yahweh specifically in that feast, the night that Babylon fell, because he thought he was fine, he was safe, and that God was going to be wrong. Well, Daniel begins describing what he saw in the vision here in verse 2. He was transported in spirit to Susa, which is pictured on the map behind me. Now, this is remarkable because at the time of this vision, Susa was not yet a dominant capital. But it became exactly that, the capital of Persia, meaning that God is placing Daniel at the geographic center of the coming great empire. And so it's not yet that, but God in his providence puts Daniel there. Of course, Daniel's not physically there. He is going to be there in spirit, much like Ezekiel experienced in Ezekiel's vision, where he is transported from Babylon back to the temple in Jerusalem. Well, this is where this empire is going to be situated. And later on, we're going to be reading about Esther and Nehemiah, and they are going to both be in this city, the city of Susa. So this is going to be a very important city. In fact, once the Babylonian Empire falls, the great documents, of course, from Babylon are going to find a home in the capital of the Persian Empire. And in 1901, archaeologists actually found the Code of Hammurabi there. And so this was actually a very key place for the Persians. Now, as such, at this time, the Lord is showing Daniel the future from the future's point of view. And so Daniel isn't even certain at this point, as he's transported to Susa, what the significance of this is going to be. But he's about to find out. He's about to find out. And we see the further description here. Susa was in the northeastern part of the province of Elam, which is where the Ulai Canal ran at that time. Now, today that canal is dry. But this area is in modern day Iran. And so if you're wondering, okay, where are we seeing this in terms of modern geopolitics, you can see the Persian Gulf down there, and then you can also see the area of modern day Iran. Now, that is the setting for the vision. Daniel describes looking at this vision. He's examining. He's trying to figure out what's going on. He obviously perceives where he is, but then he notices an animal standing there, and it's a ram. This isn't the first time he's seen a vision with animals. Of course, chapter 7, he sees it, but these are going to be different animals than he saw before. This time, it's going to be a ram. That doesn't mean that the animals are going to depict something different than they did before. God has a reason, though, for showing him these particular animals. He sees a ram with two horns standing in front of the canal. Of course, uh, this is going to be very picturesque of the Medo-Persian Empire. That's right where the capital is, and verse 20 actually does explain that that's what we are looking at. The ram that you saw with the two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. And so the ram is a fitting symbol. Why is that? Well, one study notes astrology, because the first century BC zodiac lists, or a zodiac list identifies Persia as a ram. And so that might be one reason that God chose the ram. Another study, though, notes that the Persian ruler carried a gold head of a ram when he marched before his army. And so there might have been something that was known in Daniel's day. Oh, yes, the ram, this Persia. That may have been something that was known or would be known at some point. You could imagine what God's people were doing when they heard about the Persians on the march, marching with a ram, and they're saying, God's already revealed to us a ram. This is it. This is them. And so that must have been very exciting for them. But whatever the case, the ram is a good picture to typify this empire. Now, the two horns are coming from the ram. What do we see there? Well, we see one picturing the Medes and one picturing the Persians, because again, this is a empire that comes together from two great empires. The Media Empire was greater at one point, but then the Persian Empire becomes greater. And that's what we see with history. Just like how we see the bear race up on one side in chapter 7, verse 5, historically speaking, the Medes were initially dominant, but then the Persians rose up under Cyrus and they became the stronger power. God predicted not only the empire, but the internal power structure with this imbalance. And so it's incredible to see this detail that God is revealing with this empire. And now verse 4 describes the unstoppable expansion of this empire. Daniel says that he saw the ram budding westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there any to rescue from his power. But he did as he pleased and magnified himself. Well, we see this ram, and if you have the ESV, maybe you have the word charging instead of budding. If you have the King James, New King James, you might just have the word pushing there. This is the ram expanding out its domain and to nearly all four cardinal directions, to three of them anyway. And historically, that's what we see. Persia conquered westward into Babylon and into Asia Minor. And then it began to conquer northward into Armenia and then southward into Egypt. As the Reformation Study Bible notes here, Medo-Persia became the largest empire in the world until this point. And so, of course, there were larger empires that came later, but this was the largest empire at this point. And so this was quite the accomplishment that we see. And no one could stand before it. From a human perspective, at this time, Persia looked invincible. It is just coming and it is taking over everything. Could you imagine just just having a small farm somewhere, and you're hearing they just took over. They just took over this area. They just took over that area. They just took over this area. They're growing. They're going out. You're these far-flung lands that you probably could only imagine. You could never travel there because it would be too expensive and too long a journey. And yet the empire is stretching all the way into these far-flung lands. This is incredible. And it's happening quickly. And as such, the ram becomes a little proud. He did as he pleased. Now, of course, that is something that is part of the human condition, our fallen condition. When we become proud, we often do what we please. We often want to pursue our own pleasures, our own wants and desires, and that is going to be something that we do see that culminates in the Antichrist, especially as we see that he magnifies himself. That's going to be much like the mighty king of Daniel 11:3. He's going to magnify himself. But he's not the only one. He's not the only one. And we're going to see this elsewhere. That's because the Antichrist is the culmination of everything bad in these kingdoms. He's the culmination of everything bad in our human condition. He is, in fact, the culmination of everything bad in satanic as well. But we'll get into that. But God is showing Daniel this advance. And he's showing him this in advance so that God's people would know that even with the rise of this massive empire, that all of this is according to God's plan. Nothing is surprising God. Empires don't rise randomly. They rise by divine appointment. Take a look back to Daniel 2. It's been a little while since we've been in Daniel 2, and it's worth reminding ourselves here of what he said in chapter 2, verse 21. We see there of God that it is he who changes the times and epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. God will remove Belshazzar. God will raise up Cyrus, his servant, his shepherd, in his place. Persia's coming, but it's not coming outside of God's control. This is all within God's sovereign control. God's people need to know this. They need to know something else as well. God's people need not worry about Persia. Other people might be worried about everything that I was just saying, but God's people need not worry about it. Verses 5 through 7 here. We read, "While I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had the two horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and shattered his two horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power." Wow. Obviously, with the map I just showed, Persia is going to be a powerhouse. But God's people need not fear. God can always raise up a greater power later on. And so while Daniel is still pondering the ram, a new figure bursts onto the scene, and we see that it is a male goat. Now again, if you look down to verse 21, we see that this is Greece, the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. And who is that first king? Of course, that is Alexander the Great. You might say, wow, he really had a lot to live up to with that name. Well, we call him the Great by remembering him in history because of what he accomplished. He did not bear that name until later, although he may have wanted that name. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. This was a famous conqueror, of course. You may have learned about him in history class. He was born in the year 356 BC. Now, already, if you're thinking about that, 356 BC, we are talking about something that's a little bit later than where Daniel is, and that is later than the Persian Empire and its growth. We'll look at that. He was the son of Philip of Macedon, who had united Greece. So Philip himself was a bit of a conqueror. He united Greece, and he had his son educated by none other than Aristotle. And so this is a pretty prestigious youth here. And unfortunately, while he was still a very young man, his father was murdered. And so at 20 years old, he was only 20 years old, he succeeded his father, and he continued his father's planning. And his father's planning was this: we're going to invade Persia. We're going to invade Persia. Now, God foretells all of this. Now, we're rewinding back and we're looking at Daniel, and he is having a vision in the middle of the 6th century about something that's going to come later. And he sees this foretold in this way, that there's a goat, a male goat, that is coming from the west. Well, the west would be over the Mediterranean. And it was moving with lightning speed. It was moving so fast that it's not even touching the ground. And of course, you can imagine how fast some animals can run. Well, this goat is running so fast that it's not even touching the ground. That, of course, is speaking of its immense speed. And that is something that we also see in history. It was only it was only a year and a half after Alexander was crowned king that he decides to attack the Persians. He decides he's ready, let's do it, and he attacks the Persians. That same year, in the year 334 BC, he wins a major victory in the Battle of Granicus. And that one battle, that one victory ended Persian dominance. It ended Persian dominance. Within subsequent battles, Alexander completely dismantled the Persian Empire, and all of this happened within a 3-year period. That great Persian Empire, Alexander the Great dismantled it, and it only took him 3 years to do it. He did it even though the Persians greatly outnumbered the Greeks. The Persians had the numbers. And Alexander the Great just came in there with the Greeks, and he destroyed the Persian Empire. He stood as the master of the Near East before he was 25 years old. It's amazing. And there's some interesting nuance that the Lord reveals here, because we see here that the male goat not only came in fast, but he also came in with wrath, and that he was enraged at the ram. Now that's interesting, because as you go back into history, you might see where the hatred comes from. Alexander's feelings toward Persia were personal, and they were, of course, national. You might remember, for instance, that great famous battle of Thermopylae, where the Spartans under King Leonidas resisted the Persian advance. And that was in the year 480 BC. So this was before Alexander's time, but this is part of what is fueling Alexander. He's seeing the Persians trying to make inroads. This isn't the only time. There's going to be continued skirmishes with Persia. And this leads Alexander, that led his father Philip, to be bitter toward the Persians. And that led to his determination for victory some 150 years later. Now, again, this is all staggering. One study notes this: the greatness that had characterized the ram now belonged to the goat. Previously, none could escape the ram's power in verse 4. Now none could escape from the goat. Persia need not be a concern for God's people, because God would send Alexander the Great to take out Persia, and then the kingdom of Greece would be even larger. It would be even mightier. It would go even further. And it became, of course, the largest empire in world history until that point. And so the Jews would live under Persian rule for 2 centuries. And while it would never be easy, it was never the final word. God had a plan. And that plan would then be raised up from Greece. And God would use Greece to judge Persia. And in the process, he would do something else. And this is what's spectacular as you look at the map of the Greek Empire. Not only is Alexander the Great going and conquering these areas, he is bringing with him Greek culture and, more importantly, the Greek language. He is bringing everyone under one tongue known as the Koine tongue, the common tongue. And it would be this tongue with which the disciples of Christ could go out and spread the gospel. And wherever they went, they knew that they could talk to someone who spoke the same language, because everyone spoke Koine Greek. And they could write the Bible under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit in Koine Greek. And wherever they went, they could find someone who could read that Bible. God is using Alexander in a way that Alexander himself doesn't even know about. He is laying the groundwork for the spread of the gospel. And that's what's so incredible, so neat about this. And so God's people needn't worry about any of this. They needn't worry about this conqueror. Because God also says this. God says that they do not need to worry about Alexander. Let's look at this. Verse 8. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly. But as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken. And in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now again, obviously, Alexander's conquest was breathtaking. His conquests were breathtaking. By the year 327 BC, he had pushed all the way to the Indus River. His empire extended from Greece all the way to India, in other words. Throughout most of the known world today, it eclipsed the Persian Empire. We looked at that map already. Alexander, as a result of all this, began to magnify himself. He became a little puffed up. He began to do this. And if you have studied some of the Greek myths, you might know the significance of some of these names. He began to talk about Achilles. He began to talk about Hercules. And he said, you know what? These guys are my ancestors. And he began to see himself in this line. this great line of these mighty men. And he began to do something else. He began to require that people everywhere that he had conquered worship him. Well, what does Scripture say? Pride goes before destruction. And at the very pinnacle of his power, that great horn snapped. And this is because Alexander died in Babylon in the year 323 at the age of 32 or 33 years old. Why did he die? It was probably malaria. It could have also been complications from a drinking binge that he was on. But in an instant, the man who had conquered the world was gone. That was it. He's dead. And in his place, in the place of the broken horn, arose four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven. They wanted him to name a successor. He did not. He had gotten what he had gotten through fighting, and he wanted whoever would follow him to get what they get through fighting. And so fighting came, and it was a bloody period. And eventually, four of Alexander's generals in particular carved up his empire. And so you had Ptolemy in Egypt and in southern Syria. You had Seleucus in Syria to the east. And then you had Lysimachus in Thrace and in Asia Minor. And then, of course, Cassander in Macedonia. Now, two of these names, Ptolemy and Seleucus, will become important to the Jewish people and to the book of Daniel. So do pay attention to especially those two names, because they will come up later on the test. You will have to know those two names a little bit later in the book of Daniel. But note this, that the Greek Empire didn't so much disappear as it fragmented. And these would continue to fight. There would be shifting loyalties through the years. Some of the boundary lines would shift. Here is a map kind of showing the Grecian Empire divided. And you can see, of course, the Seleucid Empire taking up a large portion of that map. But then, of course, the others are there as well. And there's going to be shifting, there's going to be fighting, and we're going to look at that a little bit more, especially, I think, in Daniel 11. We will see the conflicts that are to come with all of that. But notice the contrast here. The ram that had magnified himself, or the ram had magnified itself, and now the goat has done the same. You know, human pride, again, is a recurring theme through Daniel. But every time we see this pride happen, the Lord breaks this pride down. We saw it happen with Nebuchadnezzar. We see it happen with Belshazzar. We see it happen with the Persians. We see it happen with Alexander the Great. Every proud ruler meets the same end. But that doesn't mean that God didn't use this for his purposes. Again, even though there's all this fighting that's happening, the whole world is now speaking Greek. And that's going to prepare the way for the whole world to get the Bible as well. Now, the Jews may have been worried about the Persians. They may have been worried once they found out the Greeks were coming, what would happen to them. But they would largely be safe until a little after this period. Because their concern is not so much with Alexander, nor even with the four horns themselves necessarily. No, the concern would come even after that. That's because of the four horns, one little horn is about to arise, and that's the ruler that Daniel will turn his attention to next. And so let's look at these last two verses here as we see that God's people need to know about Antiochus. Antiochus. Verses 9 and 10. Out of one of them, that would be one of the four, came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to earth, and it trampled them down. Now, again, there's a lot of parallels that we can draw between chapter 8 and chapter 7. And as we were looking at chapter 7, you may say, okay, there are these beasts there are beasts here. The Persian Empire is mentioned in chapter 7 pictorially through the beast, as is the Grecian Empire. So maybe, just maybe, the little horn here is the same little horn that Daniel 7 talks about. And though you could be forgiven for making that mistake, it is a mistake. This is not the same person that's being addressed here. For one, the little horn in Daniel 7 doesn't arise from the Grecian Empire. It arises from the Roman Empire, which is to come afterward, and is even at this point in time starting to grow in power. No, this little horn comes from the Grecian Empire. And that's what we're looking at now. This is a different Antichrist, if you will, a different threat. And he arises from the Seleucid dynasty in Syria about 126 years later from where we've been talking about. We are talking about a man named Antiochus. Antiochus the fourth. He's the fourth person to bear the title or the name Antiochus. He gives himself the title Epiphanes, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But he reigned from the year 175 to 164 BC. Again, I don't want you guys to be confused. Remember, BC, we are counting down to Christ. And so the lower the number, the later in history we are. And that is always confusing because you're used to numbers going up as we go later in history. But in this case, they are going down. Now, he is the little horn because he began in relative insignificance. He was not the oldest brother of a family. He wasn't the eldest son who went forth to conquer like Alexander the Great. No, in fact, he was the youngest. And he was sent as a hostage to Rome at one point. He did return. He was a political schemer. And he eventually seized the throne through bribery, flattery, and murder. So not exactly the best character in history. But in this way, the little horn grew to be exceedingly great. He became king, even though he was little at one point. He was little in influence. He became great. And that right there is, of course, part of what draws us in, because we see that with the Antichrist as well, the final Antichrist. He will begin as someone insignificant. A lot of people like to theorize who the Antichrist is going to be. He's not someone that we are going to recognize immediately. He's going to be someone of small account at first. And then he will become someone greater. That's the first picture, the first foreshadowing that we see with Antiochus. Now, once he became king, he then began to campaign south into Egypt. He then began to go east against the Parthians. And then, most important for us, he also set his sight on the beautiful land. Now, this is a little map for this period, and you can see the Seleucid Empire at this point has settled to the north, and then to the south you have the Ptolemaic Empire, and then you have a growing Parthian Empire over to the east. Well, in between the Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires is the beautiful land. Why is it beautiful? Because of the landscapes? Well, there are some very lovely landscapes in Israel, but that's not why it's called beautiful. The Holy Spirit uses that word here because it is spiritually attractive. Because this is the land by which the Lord himself calls his people. This is the land through which he will call forth his Messiah. Psalm 48:2 says that Zion is a thing of beauty and it is a joy for the whole earth, but Antiochus would have all of this for himself, and that's what we will start to see here. And the horn grew up. The horn grew in prominence and stature, and according to verse 10, it's growing larger and larger. Now, why is it growing larger? How is it growing larger? How is it growing upward into the heavens? Well, in its pride, or I could say, since we are talking about a person, in his pride. Antiochus is becoming puffed up. How is he doing that? Well, we're going to see that, and we'll repeat this again next time, that he began to have the Greek term theos, printed on his coins. On his coinage, people would see that he was God. He was God. Theos, God. And he applied to himself that word epiphanies, which means the manifestation. Woo. Now that's pretty arrogant, where he is saying he is the manifestation of God. Of course, others didn't like the term epiphanies. Some began to apply the term epinomies, which would make him Antiochus the furious, Antiochus the mad. But he's growing up, and we see in verse 10 that this cosmic language. It says that the horn grew up to the host of heaven. And then we see something strange. It caused some of the hosts and some of the stars to fall to earth, and it trampled them down. Oh boy, there's so much to talk about here. This language often is used to speak of angelic activity. But we mustn't think, of course, that a mere man is engaging in some kind of heavenly assault. He's not attacking angels. Rather, verse 24 of this chapter tells us that his assault is aimed at God's people, at the saints. That's because the term host, even though they can talk about an army, and so we think, okay, hosts of heaven, army of heaven, stars, we think of angels. Well, this can also symbolize the people of God. And we see that in Genesis 15. We see that in Exodus 12. We see that later in Daniel 12. And so when we consider this, verse 10, many commentators interpret this as describing the intense persecution of God's people. This is meant to reflect the ego, the pride, the presumption of Antiochus as he is attacking God's people. And that is, of course, what we see in history. He does begin to attack God's people. He assassinated the high priest, Onias III. His troops murdered thousands of innocents. He also plundered the holy temple, which had been rebuilt. He forbade circumcision and Sabbath observances. And then, on December 25th, 167 BC, he erected an altar to Zeus in the Holy of Holies inside the temple. And he there sacrificed a pig. This was the abomination of desolation. And Jesus says, we're still looking for it to come in the Antichrist final act. As we think, okay, what could the abomination of desolation be that the final Antichrist is going to commit? We see with Antiochus a picture of what that might be. Antiochus is a foreshadowing of the future Antichrist. And that might be why verse 10 uses this odd cosmic language. Because as I was studying this is one of the reasons I spent a lot of time on this particular sermon. As I said, no, there's something more here. This may reflect something that is yet to come. Turn with me to Revelation chapter 12. Revelation chapter 12. Now, some of you may recognize Revelation 12 as the chapter of the vision of the woman who is Israel. And for the sake of time, let's just agree, either to disagree if you disagree, but agree that this is Israel. And the vision of the great red dragon. And of course, that is a vision of the devil. And in Revelation chapter 12, verse 4, the Apostle John, under the inspiration of the same Holy Spirit that Daniel writes under, he sees a great red dragon whose tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And this parallel is unmistakable. This chapter of Revelation is reviewing something of history as it prepares us for the next great chapter of Revelation, where we see the beast and we see this picture of the Antichrist and what he is going to do and his persecution of God's people and his blasphemies against God. We're seeing the satanic power behind the Antichrist in Revelation 12. And it is that same power, that same demonic, satanic power that energized Antiochus during the intertestamental period to rage against God, to rage against his people, and to commit so many atrocities. And so in these centuries between the testaments, the dragon tried to destroy the woman's seed before the child could be born. Because remember, Antiochus' time comes just on the heels, or I should say it precedes the birth of Jesus Christ. And so the devil stirs him, just as he stirs the Hellenistic kings, the false philosophies, the brutal persecutions that might snuff out the line of promise. He almost succeeded in Bethlehem, of course. You remember what Herod did with his decree to kill all the children, all the male children. But Christ was born nonetheless. He lived his perfect life. He died that sacrifice God called him to, and he ascended into heaven, just as Revelation 12:4 says. He was caught up to God. The dragon tried and failed. The dragon will try again in the final days. But there is comfort for every believer in every age, that the same God who persevered, or preserved, I should say, who preserved a remnant in the days of the Maccabees, which is this time period here. The same God who protected the infant Jesus, he is the same God who will protect his people when that final Antichrist arises. And the dragon's tail may sweep stars to the ground, but he cannot touch the one who holds the stars in his hands. Revelation 1:16. And that's Jesus Christ. As we wrap this up, we're just getting into this. We're just scratching the surface here. But it is important for us to see that this was an important prophecy for those in the 6th century, for believers. They needed to know what was coming before the birth of the Messiah. And God, in his providence, not only predicts what's coming, he protects his people. They survived the Persians, they survived the Greeks, they survived the madman Antiochus. While we still have more of this chapter to examine, we know that the Jews survived their encounter and that they would continue on. We also need to know, though, that God not only protects the people then, he will protect us now. He will protect us now. The spirit of Antichrist is already at work today. We can see it in cultural pressures. We can see it in political machinations. We can see it in the spiritual deceptions, which are continuing to grow and will grow until that final moment of human history. Thankfully, we know that there is a God who is sovereign over all of this. And he will continue to protect his people one way or another.